Victor Hartford sat in his expansive leather chair, staring out of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his high-rise office. The sprawling city below, with its endless rows of gleaming skyscrapers and twinkling lights, seemed like a distant world to him. The office, perched on the top floor of the Hartford Tower, his company's flagship headquarters, was an imposing fortress of success. Everything in his life, from the polished hardwood floors to the sleek glass walls, screamed wealth and achievement. He had everything a man could want: a beautiful home and a gated community, a collection of luxury cars, and a business empire that spanned continents. But as he gazed out over the city that he had built with his own hands, there was a gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach. His thoughts drifted to his children, Emma, Liam, and Sophie. They were the reason he had worked so tirelessly to amass this fortune. He had always believed that one day they would inherit the legacy he had spent a lifetime building. But now, at the cusp of his success, a troubling question lingered in his mind. Did they love him for who he was, or only for what he could give them? Victor's thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of his office door. He turned to see his youngest daughter, Sophie, standing in the doorway. "Dad, are you busy?" she asked, her voice tentative but warm. Sophie had always been the quiet one, while Emma was driven and ambitious, and Liam was outgoing and brash. Sophie had always been the artist, the dreamer. She didn't have the same sharp business sense as her siblings, but her sincerity and kindness had always made her stand out, to him in ways the others never did. "Now, sweetheart, come in," Victor said, motioning to the chair across from his desk. Sophie hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether to take a seat. She had always been a bit of a mystery to him. She was the one who seemed to shy away from the trappings of wealth, often retreating into her own world of painting and poetry. But lately, she had started spending more time at his office, asking about the business, showing a curiosity that Victor couldn't ignore. "How's everything going, Dad?" she asked, her gaze flickering to the view outside. "Same as always," he replied, forcing a smile. "Nothing I can't handle." But his mind wasn't really on the conversation. He was thinking about how Emma and Liam had both grown more distant over the years. Emma had always been the ambitious one, pursuing her law degree and then a career in corporate law. She was sharp, calculated, and successful. But Victor couldn't shake the feeling that she only saw him as a means to an end. She rarely came to see him without needing something, whether it was advice, contacts, or an introduction to one of his business partners. Liam, on the other hand, had always been the charmer. A natural salesman with an endless stream of ideas, he had spent most of his adult life trying to get his father's approval. But unlike Emma, Liam's success was always tied to his father's fortune. He had inherited his father's gift for entrepreneurship, but it was clear that Liam was more interested in the trappings of wealth than in the legacy of Hartford enterprises. His ventures more often than not had failed, and Victor had been there to bail him out time and time again. And that's what worried him. Emma and Liam seemed to love the lifestyle, the power, the prestige that came with their last name. But did they truly care about him, the person who had raised them? Or were they simply trying to climb higher on the ladder of success by using him as their stepping stone? Victor shifted in his chair, the weight of the question pressing down on him. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice tinged with contemplation. "Maybe it's time to test something." Sophie raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Test something? What do you mean?" Victor leaned forward, his gaze intense. "I'm not sure if my children love me, Sophie. I think they love what I can provide for them, but do they love me for who I am?" Sophie didn't respond immediately. She knew her father was a man of action, always moving forward, always thinking. She could see the frustration in his eyes, the uncertainty that had crept into his otherwise confident demeanor. "What are you thinking, Dad?" she asked softly. Victor took a deep breath, as if considering how best to explain. "I think it's time to see if they care about me, Sophie. I want to know if they would still love me if I didn't have all this." He gestured around the office, as if to encompass the world of wealth and status that surrounded them. "If I lost everything, would they still be here for me?" Or would they disappear the moment they realized there was nothing left to gain? Sophie was taken aback. She had never seen her father like this before, vulnerable, questioning his own relationships. It was hard for her to imagine a life without the opulence that defined the Hartford family. But she understood the desire for validation, for assurance that those closest to you were there for the right reasons. While you stand far away, I feel as if I am watching true stars. "Dad, you're not serious, are you?" she asked, her voice a mix of concern and disbelief. Victor met her gaze, his expression resolute. "I'm serious, Sophie. I've made up my mind." The days that followed were a blur of activity. Victor began putting his plan into motion, though he kept it all secret. He liquidated his assets, sold off properties, and transferred his wealth into anonymous accounts. He erased his name from the business, leaving only a skeleton crew to handle the day-to-day operations of Hartford Enterprises. Every connection he had built over the years, every relationship forged through his wealth, was severed. He didn't want anyone to be able to trace him back to the life he had once led. Victor knew that the hardest part of all would be his children. He would need to distance himself from them, without them ever suspecting the truth. He would assume a new identity, one where no one could associate him with the wealth and status that had defined his life for so long. It took only a few days to finalize everything. By the end of the week, the Hartford Tower had been sold, along with the private jet and the summer home in the Hamptons. His connections in high society were wiped clean from the record. Victor Hartford, the wealthy businessman, was no more. Instead, a new man would emerge. Daniel Walker. Victor, now Daniel, purchased a modest home in a middle-class neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The house was small, with peeling paint on the shutters and a broken fence in the yard, but it was quiet, unassuming. It was the perfect place for him to disappear into anonymity. The next step was finding a job. Daniel Walker wasn't the kind of man who would sit idle. He had always been a hard worker, and he knew he needed to stay busy to avoid suspicion. He took a job at a local hardware store, a job he had once never imagined doing in his wildest dreams. But now, in this new life, it felt right. The work was physical, simple, and humble, but it kept him grounded. On his first day at the store, Daniel pulled on his faded apron and stepped behind the counter, taking inventory of the supplies. His hands, once used to signing million-dollar contracts, now counted bolts and nails. His mind, once occupied by board meetings and international markets, now focused on helping customers find the right type of paintbrush. The world of wealth was behind him now. The lavish dinners, the charity galas, the power lunches, they were all in the past. Daniel Walker was just another man in a small town struggling to make a living. And in the quiet moments, when he was alone in his new life, he would wonder, how long would it take for his children to realize he was gone? Would they come looking for him? And most importantly, would they still love him if they knew who he had become? The news of Victor Hartford's supposed downfall spread faster than he had anticipated. While he had carefully orchestrated every detail of his sudden exit from the world of wealth, he had underestimated the power of whispers in high society. His name, once synonymous with success, had become the subject of gossip at every cocktail party and boardroom meeting. It wasn't long before the rumors reached his children, each of whom would grapple with the news in their own way. Emma was in the middle of a client meeting when her phone buzzed on the conference table. She glanced at the screen. It was Julia, a close friend from law school. Emma silenced the call and returned to her presentation, her tone crisp and professional as she laid out a complex legal strategy for her client. But Julia rarely called during work hours, and the nagging curiosity lingered in the back of her mind. It wasn't until much later, as she sipped a glass of wine in her high-rise apartment, that she returned the call. Julia's voice was breathless, as though she'd been holding on to the news all day. "Emma, have you heard about your dad?" Julia asked, her tone laced with concern. Emma frowned, setting her glass down. "What about him?" "I didn't want to say anything, but I heard he's in some serious financial trouble, like everything gone kind of trouble. A friend of mine works in real estate, and she said he sold the Hartford Tower. And not just that, he sold his house, too. What's going on? Emma's heart sank. The Hartford Tower, their family home, sold? That didn't make any sense. Her father was one of the most meticulous people she knew. If he were having financial issues, he would have mentioned it. Or so she thought. "I'll talk to him," Emma said, her voice sharp with determination. "Thanks for letting me know." The next morning, Emma called her father. She expected him to laugh off the rumors, to reassure her that everything was under control. But when he answered, his voice was subdued, almost weary. Aunt, he said, "It's good to hear from you." "Dad, what's going on?" she demanded. "I'm hearing all kinds of things about you selling the tower, the house. Are you in trouble?" Victor paused, as though choosing his words carefully. "I've had to make some adjustments," he admitted. "The market's been tough, and I decided it was time to step back." Emma wasn't convinced her father had never been one to step back. He thrived on challenges, on finding solutions. Something didn't add up. "Let me help you," she said, her voice softening. "I can lend you some money, or we can figure something out together." Victor's tone turned firm. "I appreciate the offer, Emma, but I don't need help. This is something I need to handle on my own." His refusal stung. Emma prided herself on being someone who could solve problems, and now her father was shutting her out. She hung up the phone, feeling both frustrated and suspicious. Was he being proud, or was there something he wasn't telling her? Either way, she decided to give him space, believing that he would reach out when he was ready. In the meantime, she focused on her work, burying her concern beneath a mountain of case files. Liam heard about his father's situation from a business associate. He was at a networking event, nursing a bourbon on the rocks, when a well-dressed man approached him with a sympathetic expression. "Liam Hartford, right?" the man asked, extending a hand. Liam nodded, shaking the man's hand. "That's me." "And you are?" "David Carter. I used to work with your father on a few projects. Listen, I just wanted to say I'm sorry to hear about what's happening with him. It must be a tough time for your family." Liam's stomach tightened. He plastered on a smile, though his mind raced. "I'm not sure what you're talking about," he said carefully. David looked surprised. "You don't know? He sold the Hartford Tower last week. Word is he's stepping down completely. Some people are saying he's broke." The word broke hit Liam like a punch to the gut. His father, broke. That couldn't be right. He excused himself from the conversation and immediately called Victor. "Dad, what's going on?" he demanded. "I just heard the craziest thing. Are you seriously out of money?" Victor sighed, his tone weary. "Liam, it's true. I've had to sell off a lot of assets. Things didn't go as planned, and now I'm starting over." Liam's mind reeled. His entire life had been built around the assumption that his father's wealth was a safety net, a foundation he could always rely on. Without it, he felt untethered, adrift. "Let's start something together," Liam said, desperation creeping into his voice. "A new business. I've got ideas, Dad, and with your experience—" Victor cut him off. "Liam, I appreciate the thought, but I'm not in a position to start anything right now." "But no, Liam," Victor said firmly. "This is something I need to figure out on my own." Liam hung up, feeling both rejected and panicked. He couldn't imagine life without the financial security his father had always provided. Determined to fix things, he began pursuing risky business ventures, pouring what little savings he had into speculative investments. But his inexperience and haste led to disaster. Within weeks, he found himself drowning in debt, with no clear way out. Sophie was the last to hear about her father's supposed downfall. She had always been somewhat removed from the family's business affairs, preferring the solitude of her art studio to the hustle and bustle of corporate life. When a mutual acquaintance mentioned that Victor had sold his home and stepped down from the company, Sophie's first reaction was disbelief. "No," she said, shaking her head. "That doesn't sound like my dad. He loves that company. He wouldn't just walk away." But as the days passed, Sophie began to piece together the truth. Unlike her siblings, she didn't confront Victor with accusations or offers of help. Instead, she called him and simply asked how he was doing. "I'm managing," Victor said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "It's a different kind of life, but I'm getting by." Sophie could hear the strain in his voice. "Dad, why don't you come to my studio?" she suggested. "We can have coffee and talk. I've got a new piece I want to show you." Victor hesitated. I don't want to burden you, Sophie." "You're not a burden," she said firmly. "You're my dad." Victor agreed, and a few days later he visited Sophie's studio. It was a small, sunlit space filled with canvases and jars of paintbrushes. Sophie made him coffee and showed him her latest work, a vivid landscape that seemed to shimmer with life. "It's beautiful," Victor said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. Sophie smiled. "I've been working on it for weeks. It's not finished yet, but it's getting there." They sat together, sipping coffee in comfortable silence. For the first time in weeks, Victor felt a sense of peace. Sophie didn't press him for details about his financial situation or offer unsolicited advice. She simply gave him the space to be himself. "If you ever need a place to stay, my couch is always open," Sophie said lightly, though her eyes were serious. Victor chuckled. "I appreciate that, Sophie, but I'll be okay." The children's paths diverge. As the weeks went by, each of Victor's children continued to wrestle with the news in their own way. Emma threw herself into her work, convincing herself that her father's pride was the reason for his refusal to accept her help. Liam spiraled further into debt, his desperation blinding him to the consequences of his actions. And Sophie, ever the quiet artist, maintained her connection with Victor, offering him the simple comfort of companionship without judgment. Victor watched from a distance, observing their reactions with a heavy heart. His plan was working, but it was also revealing painful truths about the people he loved most. Victor Hartford had never known a day of physical labor in his life, at least not in the sense most people would understand it. His career had been built on strategy, decision-making, and negotiations. He had commanded boardrooms, not shovels. But here he was, crouching on the concrete floor of a hardware store, his hands slick with grime as he attempted to fix a broken display shelf. It wasn't even a complicated task, but to Victor, it felt like an insurmountable challenge. The tools were unfamiliar, the work excruciating, and the atmosphere utterly foreign. The smell of sawdust and metal lingered in his nostrils, a stark contrast to the antiseptic, sleek offices he was accustomed to. He stood up and wiped the sweat from his brow, glancing around the small, cluttered store. The shelves were packed with everything from bolts and nails to paint cans and garden supplies. It was a far cry from the glass-on-steel world of Hartford Enterprises, where decisions were made with a click of a button or a signature on a contract. This was his new life, and despite his initial bravado in leaving behind the world of luxury, Victor felt the weight of his choices more acutely with each passing day. The physical strain of manual labor wasn't just hard on his body, it was hard on his sense of self. He had always prided himself on being a man of intellect, a visionary, a builder of things that mattered. But now, in his new life as Daniel Walker, he was reduced to the role of a nameless clerk, who spent his days folding cardboard boxes and stocking shelves. He could hardly recognize the man in a mirror, his face now weathered and his hands rough and calloused. At first, he had imagined that this experiment would be a revelation, a way to determine whether his children truly loved him or merely his wealth. But as the days wore on, the challenge of living a life so far removed from everything he had known started to eat away at him. The constant worry about keeping up the facade, the loneliness of not being able to speak openly to anyone, and the strain of pretending to be someone he wasn't, all of it left him feeling increasingly isolated. He missed his old life, his old self. There were moments when he wondered if this test, this grand experiment, had been a mistake. But he couldn't go back now. The plan was already in motion. He had to see it through. Meanwhile, his children were grappling with their own struggles, their reactions to their father's downfall diverging in unexpected ways. Emma Hartford sat in her glass-walled office, her eyes fixed on the cityscape beyond. The skyscrapers stretched out in every direction, a constant reminder of her success, and yet a source of unease. She had always prided herself on her sharp mind and razor focus, and her career had been her world. She had climbed the corporate ladder with an unyielding determination, never once considering the cost. Her father's sudden fall from grace, as the media had put it, had shaken her in ways she hadn't expected. It was more than just the financial loss that concerned her. It was the fact that her father had disappeared from her life without a trace. She had tried to help, offered him money, resources, whatever he needed. But he had refused, and his refusal had only deepened the emotional distance between them. Emma could never understand why her father had chosen to shut her out when she had been willing to do anything to fix the situation. She had assumed that he would be the one to pull himself together as he always had before. But now, weeks had passed with no word from him, and the nagging feeling that she might have misread him or missed something ate at her. For the first time in years, Emma found herself questioning everything. Was she really as successful as she had always thought? Was her life so fulfilling if her relationships were in shambles? She had never stopped to ask herself why she was so driven, so obsessed with career success. Was it for the prestige, the recognition? Or was it because she was running from something deeper? A fear of emotional vulnerability, perhaps, or a fear of emotional vulnerability, perhaps, or a fear of abandonment. For the first time in her life, she had never stopped to ask herself why she was so driven, so obsessed. Was it for the prestige? She sat back in her chair and let out a long, slow breath. Her phone buzzed with another email, another case, another opportunity to climb higher, but she didn't reach for it. Instead, she closed her eyes, allowing herself to be consumed by the thought of her father. How had he been so easily willing to let go of everything he had worked for? And how had she been so blind to the fact that their relationship was crumbling? Emma had always seen herself as a pragmatist, a realist who knew how to handle her emotions and compartmentalize. But now, she couldn't ignore the creeping sense that she had lost sight of what truly mattered. She had always told herself that she would be there for her father when he needed her, but now, with the distance between them growing wider, she felt that she had failed him. Her pride stopped her from calling him again. It would be admitting that she didn't have all the answers, that she was unsure, that she had made mistakes. And that, Emma realized, was the one thing she could never allow herself to do. Liam Hartford had always been the most carefree of his siblings, the one who threw caution to the wind and never let fear of failure hold him back. He had inherited his father's entrepreneurial spirit, but none of his discipline or foresight. In many ways, he had relied on his father's fortune and connections to keep him afloat, to cushion the blow when his ventures fell apart. But now, with his father gone from the picture, Liam was forced to confront the reality of his situation. The initial shock of the news had worn off, and now a deep sense of desperation began to set in. The businesses he had started had been on shaky ground, and with the loss of his father's influence, the financial backing that had once been there was now nowhere to be found. He needed money, fast. Liam thought back to the many times he had heard his father caution him against taking risks. "It's better to make one smart move than 10 reckless ones," Victor had always said. But Liam had always dismissed his father's advice. Now he was beginning to realize how wrong he had been. Determined to make up for lost time, Liam took matters into his own hands. He reached out to a few old contacts, people who had always been willing to bet on his ideas, no matter how wild. He pitched them a new venture, a high-risk real estate deal that promised big returns. The allure of easy money was too tempting for him to resist, and the deals began to pile up. But the more he dabbled in risky investments, the more he found himself sinking deeper into debt. It was a dangerous game, but Liam didn't see any other way out. His pride refused to let him ask for help, especially not from his father. And yet, the deeper he went, the more he felt like he was drowning. He had become too proud, too stubborn to admit he had made a mistake. The weight of his decisions was starting to break him. But he pushed it down, hoping against hope that the next deal would be the one to save him. But it wasn't. Sophie Hartford had always been the quiet one, the artist who lived in the margins of her family's grand narrative. She had never been interested in wealth or status, preferring the comfort of her art studio and the solace of painting to the high-powered world her father and siblings inhabited. But now, with the news of her father's downfall. Sophie felt a deep, aching sadness. She wasn't angry with him, nor did she harm him anyway, but the emotional distance between them had become unbearable. She reached out to him in the only way she knew how, through art. She invited him to her studio, hoping that their shared love for creativity would bridge the gap between them. She didn't know what had driven him to disappear, but she needed to see him, to understand him, to help him find himself again. But when he didn't respond to her invitation, she started to feel that perhaps he was slipping away in a way that no one could fix. Sophie painted every day, each brushstroke a reflection of the turmoil inside her. She couldn't connect with her father emotionally, and she didn't know how to express what she was feeling. It was as though the man she had always known had become a stranger, and the distance between them was growing more pronounced with each passing day. She missed him, truly missed him, but she felt powerless to help him. As Victor continued to grapple with his new, difficult life, his children faced their own battles. Each one, in their own way, was wrestling with the absence of their father. But in their struggle, they were also learning something about themselves, about their own desires, their priorities, and the cost of their own choices. The road ahead would be far from easy, but it was a road they would have to walk, whether they wanted to or not. The question was no longer whether Victor could reconnect with his children, but whether they could reconnect with him and with themselves. The air was thick with tension as Victor Hartford stood in the small, sparsely decorated living room of his modest one-bedroom apartment. It had been nearly 6 months since he had made the decision to walk away from his former life, to stage the test that had been intended to reveal his children's true feelings. What he had not anticipated, however, was how deep the emotional chasm would become, or how challenging it would be to carry the weight of his own deception. The truth had been gnawing at him for weeks. The lie he had constructed, the fake identity, the emotional distance he had forced upon himself, had all been part of the plan. But as the days passed, the realization hit him harder than any business deal he had ever signed. He had not only manipulated his children, he had manipulated himself into believing that he could test love and loyalty in such an artificial way. Victor had never been one to shy away from difficult conversations. He had faced countless adversaries in boardrooms and business meetings, all of whom had tried to outmaneuver him. But the stakes now were higher than anything he had ever dealt with. His children, the ones he had spent his life building his empire for, had been caught in the crossfire of his actions. The deception had created a divide that was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. The time had come to face them, to end the game, and to reveal the truth. Victor had arranged for them to meet at his apartment, a quiet, unassuming place tucked away in the corner of a middle-class neighborhood. It was a place that no longer represented him, but it had become his reality. The apartment was small and humble, with bare walls and mismatched furniture that he had bought second-hand. The contrast between this place and the mansion he once owned was stark, but it was here that he had spent the last several months alone, with his thoughts, his doubts, and his self-inflicted pain. He had asked Emma, Liam, and Sophie to come for what he told them would be a family meeting. It was the first time in months that he had seen all 3 of them in one place, and the weight of the moment was not lost on him. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he waited for them to arrive. One by one they came through the door, each of them different from the people he had last seen. Emma was the first to walk in, her face expressionless. She was dressed in her usual sharp business attire, her posture perfect, her eyes scanning the room, with barely concealed disdain. She had always been the most polished of his children, the one who had never shown any weakness. Liam followed closely behind, looking somewhat out of place in a polo shirt and khakis, as though he was trying to appear more put together than he felt. His eyes darted around the room, his hands twitching in his pockets. He had always been the most carefree of the 3, but there was an underlying tension now that Victor could not ignore. Sophie entered last, her demeanor softer than her siblings, but no less heavy with emotion. She looked at Victor with a mixture of confusion and concern, sensing that something was different. Sophie had always been the most empathetic, and it was clear to Victor that she had known something was off about him for months. They all sat down in the small living room, the silence thick and uncomfortable. Victor could feel the weight of their eyes on him, but he had made his decision. It was time to come clean. I know you're all wondering why I called you here today, Victor began, his voice steady but tinged with regret. The truth is, I've been lying to you. For the past several months, I've been living under a different name, in a different life. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. Emma's brow furrowed, Liam shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and Sophie looked at her father with growing alarm. You've been lying to us? Emma's voice was sharp, a mixture of anger and disbelief. About what? Victor took a deep breath, the weight of his confession pressing down on him. My name is not Daniel Walker. It's Victor Hartford. I staged everything, the sale of the company, the move, the loss of my wealth. I wanted to see if you would love me for who I am, not for what I could give you. This was all a test. Emma stared at him, her mouth slightly open, as though she was trying to process what he had just said. Her face reddened, a mixture of hurt and fury in her eyes. She began, her voice shaking with disbelief. You've been playing some kind of sick game with us. Do you have any idea how manipulative that is? How could you do this to your own children? I've been worried sick about you. I tried to help you, and you just shut me out. Victor closed his eyes for a moment, the sting of Emma's words cutting deeper than he expected. I thought I was doing the right thing, he said quietly, his voice hoarse. I thought I needed to know if you loved me for me, not because of my money, my success. Do you really think I would only love you because of your money? Emma's voice rose, a mixture of frustration and hurt. I'm not a child anymore, Dad. I don't need your wealth, but what you've done, what you've put us through, is unforgivable. Victor's chest tightened, and for a moment he felt like he might choke on his own guilt. The anger in Emma's eyes was unmistakable, but there was something else there too, a hint of sadness, of realization. Her gaze softened, just a fraction, as she continued. I've spent so many years focusing on my career, on my success. I don't know what I've been running from, but I think I've lost sight of what really matters. And you, her voice broke slightly, you just showed me that. Victor said nothing, watching as Emma's harsh exterior cracked for a moment. He could see the wheels turning in her mind, the realization that maybe, just maybe, her own obsession with professional success had blinded her to the more important things in life. Liam spoke next, his voice quieter, tinged with shame. Dad, I don't even know what to say. I screwed up, big time. Victor looked at him, and there was an undeniable pain in his son's eyes. Liam had always been the risk-taker, the one who believed in chasing after the next big thing, but after the downfall of Hartford Enterprises, everything had fallen apart for him. I thought if I could get some quick money, make things right, I could fix everything, Liam admitted, his voice breaking, but I just made things worse. I'm so sorry, Dad. I don't know what I was thinking. My pride got in the way, and I just couldn't see clearly. I should have come to you. I should have trusted you. Victor felt a pang of sympathy for his son, whose impulsive nature had led him to a mountain of debt. But Liam had always been someone who struggled with feeling inadequate compared to his father. Victor had expected pride and denial, but instead he saw genuine regret. It's okay, Liam, Victor said, his voice softening. I know you were trying to fix things. You don't need to apologize to me. You just need to learn that there's more to life than money. I'm sorry I didn't teach you that sooner. Sophie, who had been silently watching the exchange, finally spoke up. I don't understand all of this, but I want you to know that I never loved you for your money, Dad. I loved you for who you are, and I still do. Victor looked at his daughter, his heart swelling with gratitude. She was the first to truly understand, the first to forgive him. Her eyes were filled with compassion, and in that moment, he realized that no test could have ever revealed what he had learned about her love for him. Sophie's love had never been contingent on anything except for who he was as a father. I'm sorry, Sophie, Victor whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I never meant to push you all away, but I didn't know how else to find the truth. Sophie smiled softly, her gentle nature shining through. It's okay, Dad. Sometimes the truth is right in front of us, You don't need to put yourself through all of this to find it. We've always loved you, and that's all that matters." As the conversation continued, Victor felt the weight of the past months lift from his shoulders. His children, his precious children, had taught him more about love and forgiveness in this single conversation than he had learned in a lifetime of building an empire. They had seen through the facade. They had reached him in ways he hadn't thought possible. Emma's self-reflection, Liam's regret, and Sophie's unwavering love were gifts he had never imagined would come from this painful journey. The truth had come to him in the most unexpected way, through his children's reactions. And in that moment, he realized that their love was worth far more than any fortune or success he could ever have amassed. After Victor's revelation to his family, the tension in the apartment was palpable, but it wasn't the same kind of tension caused by secrets. Instead, it was a raw, vulnerable tension, one that came from facing the truth and beginning the painful yet necessary process of rebuilding. Victor's revelation had cracked open the walls that had once held his family together. But those walls had been built on false pretenses, wealth, and status. Now they had the chance to build something more real, based on trust and emotional connection. The first breakthrough came with Emma. The ambitious lawyer sat down with Victor one Sunday afternoon, her tone more thoughtful than before. She confessed that her career-driven life had come at the expense of her relationships, especially with her father. She admitted to taking Victor's presence for granted, focusing too much on success and not enough on emotional connection. Victor, acknowledging his own failures, apologized for not being more emotionally available. The conversation marked the beginning of a shift between them. Victor realized that, despite giving her everything financially, he had neglected what truly mattered, his time and attention. They both promised to be more present in each other's lives, and for the first time in a long time they truly saw each other for who they were, not as symbols of wealth or ambition, but as two people needing emotional connection. Liam, the free-spirited son, had always lived in the shadow of his father's fortune and had attempted to find his own success through risky financial ventures. But when his reckless decisions left him in deep debt, he found himself confronting the harsh reality of his choices. A week after the family meeting, Liam confessed to Victor that he had been chasing financial freedom without understanding that true freedom comes from emotional maturity and responsibility. Victor, instead of reacting with anger, listened with empathy. He explained that true worth wasn't tied to money, but to how one lives with integrity and purpose. Liam, realizing the truth in his father's words, shared that he wanted to build something meaningful, not just a profitable business, but one that could create social impact. Victor, proud of his son's growth, supported his vision, seeing the potential for Liam to create a future based on values, not just financial gain. Sophie, the quiet artist of the family, had always felt a deeper connection to Victor through their shared love of creativity. She had been the first to sense that something was wrong with her father, even before the truth came out. After the revelation, Sophie didn't hesitate to reach out to Victor. She suggested they reconnect through art, proposing a project that could help others use art as a tool for emotional healing. Victor, moved by her idea, agreed to collaborate. Together, they started creating workshops designed to help people process emotional trauma through artistic expression. This project became a way for them to bond and for Victor to rediscover the emotional side of life that he had neglected for so long. Through Sophie's gentle encouragement, Victor learned to value creativity and vulnerability as tools for healing. As the days passed, Victor began to reflect on what his children had taught him. They had shown him that love and loyalty weren't measured by financial success, but by emotional connection, vulnerability, and the willingness to be there for one another. His children's growth inspired him to look at his own life differently. He had spent years chasing wealth, thinking that it was the key to everything. But now he understood that true wealth was found in relationships, in being emotionally present, and in making a positive impact on others. This new understanding led Victor to make a decision that would change the course of his future. He chose to return to the business world, but with a new purpose, to use his resources for philanthropy and to create a lasting positive impact on communities in need. This time, His focus was not rebuilding the empire he had lost, but on creating something that could make a difference in people's lives. The journey of reconnection wasn't easy, but it had brought Victor closer to his children. Emma had learned to balance her career with personal relationships. Liam had moved away from the pursuit of profit and focused on social change. Sophie continued to guide Victor through emotional and creative growth. Together, they formed a family that was more united and emotionally connected than ever before. Victor realized that the greatest treasure he could possess wasn't wealth, but the love and loyalty of his family. Victor's transformation was complete when he looked out over the city from his office window. No longer driven by the need to accumulate more wealth, he understood that true success was measured by the relationships we nurture and the positive impact we have on others. The love of his family was now his greatest asset, and he felt a deep sense of peace. True wealth, he thought, isn't found in material possessions, but in the relationships we cherish and the emotional connections we build.